We'd been warned that the landing wouldn't be, to quote, fun. The Air Force tech who clamped me into my egg-shaped seat had undersold it. As our hybrid human-alien tech stealth infiltration vehicle fired its retro boosters, my teeth almost flew out of my mouth. It felt like I'd had an entire elf landing craft crash straight into my chest. Not for the first time in our 4.5-minute hypersonic flight, I thought our little flying diamond would tear itself apart. There was no pilot, only an AI commanding the craft. Major Holbrook, myself, Wood, Corshane, and Angelus were strapped into our rearward-facing seats, which swiveled a little too late to absorb the punch of the sudden deceleration. I made a mental note to chat with the Air Force techs about this bug, if we survived the landing or anything that came next. We hadn't been told how the craft would land. I assumed we'd come down like a glider or the space shuttle. I realized how horribly wrong I was when the craft pitched nose first to the ground. If there was a window behind me, I'd be staring up at the sky now, and the invading alien fleet somewhere above it in Earth orbit. But the interior of the craft had no windows, and the AI hadn't been programmed to give us a status update on our descent. Another quality of life feature I'd need to discuss with the Air Force boys. We were all jerked upwards in our seats and against our restraints as two massive parachutes deployed, abruptly cutting the craft's deceleration. 5 seconds later, another punch from a pair of rocket motors on the nose, fired for 2.3 seconds. 1.7 seconds after that, the nose of the craft smacked into the ground, causing the body to slam down belly first and nearly making me bite my tongue in half. I realized then that I'd never inserted the mouth guard recommended by the Air Force tech who strapped me into this death machine. The same hatch we entered through blew open, letting sunlight spill into the craft and briefly blinding us. Our restraints snapped back into their seats. My head was spinning as I slowly checked my tongue to ensure I hadn't accidentally bitten off a piece. But Major Holbrook was already up and shouting at us to de-ass the Death Diamond. I grabbed my gear rifle, backpack, and duffel bag full of random kit we'd need for the mission ahead. I had no clue where we'd landed, but the sun was at high noon above us. That was good. The elves had evolved on a low-light planet and had superior night vision, but they didn't like the sun much and were less active during the day. We still weren't taking chances and immediately made a dash for some nearby rubble, diving behind it and discarding our bags. Rifles at the ready, we scanned the area for danger. Not far enough, get further back and behind cover. Major Holbrook was the last out of the craft and ran right by us. I didn't need telling twice. If the Major was running, then so were the rest of us. We followed him to a ruined building 50 meters away, where he beckoned us behind the remains of a concrete wall. 25, 26, 27, get down! The Major ducked, and not a second later, our flying diamond blew itself to pieces. Charges detonated in rapid succession, ensuring the elves would find nothing useful in the wreckage. Thermite consumed even the metal, burning hot enough to be blinding if you looked in its direction. Well, there goes our only ride home. Wood was half smiling, his version of a joke. We all knew the Air Force's Flying Diamond was a one-way ride, just good enough to infiltrate a small squad deep behind enemy territory. Our mission was so top secret we'd had our brief only hours before boarding the craft. We were losing this war, and not just us, the whole world. After a year of fighting, what everyone needed most was a win to rally around. So we were taking back the capital of the United States. Well, not us. We were here to do recon, locate, and neutralize the local breeding factories, where the elves cloned their soldiers and fed reinforcements to the front lines. To do that, we had to make contact with any local resistance. Despite very little communication with anyone in the Capitol ruins, we'd been promised there was one. The only way we were going home was when the US Army liberated Washington, D.C., but unless the Major was hiding some mission details from us, and he almost always was, I had no clue how we'd find the resistance. The elves had a habit of killing any military-age human in occupied territory, or worse, they could melt you down and consume your memories. That's how they made their soldiers better and learned some of our secrets. Then there was the other thing, the biological weapons they had started creating out of human captives. I shuddered involuntarily, not fancying running into those again. I've always been a West Coast kid, only ever seen the Capitol on TV or in movies, so I had no idea where we'd landed. The devastation only made things worse. until we cleared what seemed like rows of apartments or housing and finally got some clear sight lines. In the distance was the Washington Monument, surprisingly intact. From that, we deduced we'd landed south of the city, somewhere across the river in Alexandria. The city had seen some of the fiercest fighting on the planet, with the US Army and Marines making the invaders pay dearly for every block they took. At a staggering cost though, before we left, we'd been informed that recon had fixed the main elf positions just northeast of the city. They had likely planned on taking the capital and then pushing north to link up with the assault that touched down in New York, then sweeping north to Toronto. But their forces had been too depleted, and it took them at least 2 months to build their genetic fabrication facilities, where they cloned new soldiers, and a month to grow each new batch. Civilians had fled Washington in the first weeks of fighting, though many chose to stay and fight as militias. Intelligence estimated the elves had landed around 1.5 million soldiers for the Washington campaign and lost around 1.2 million in the attempt. The military hadn't released official casualty numbers, but flush with conscripts drafted in the early warning months of the invasion, there had been around 500,000 troops here with a few 100,000 militia volunteers. The elves did not take prisoners, and only a few thousand had evacuated from the fall of Washington. It was officially the bloodiest battle in American history, and the scars were all around us as we picked our way through shattered columns of vehicles. Abrams tanks lay in ruins just a few dozen meters from elf tanks, themselves blasted open by the big 120mm guns. Armored vehicles here had fought at knife fight ranges in many places. Wood, who was leading our column, threw a hand up silently, and we immediately froze. He waved it slightly to his left, signaling us to duck behind the nearest available cover. Rifles up, we scanned the surroundings. Well, whoever you are, you're not elves, that's for sure. The voice was coming from ahead and slightly above us. I powered up my rifle's thermal sight and looked, but couldn't spot anything. Suddenly part of the wall seemed to fall away. No, it was a camo blanket made of special mesh to block infrared energy, and with a speckled pattern that perfectly fit the ruined wall. More blankets moved aside as several soldiers revealed their expertly hidden position. The first soldier to speak hopped down from his perch, his rifle slung down at the low ready, ever cautious. He was grinning though as he approached, and we pulled ourselves out of cover. "Sergeant First Class Jackson, pleasure to meet visitors. I take it that was you falling out of the sky." Major Holbrook introduced himself and shook the sergeant's hand rather than saluting. "That was us, Sergeant. We're on a mission, and I'm guessing you're exactly who we were hoping to run into. Hell, all that noise you made touching down, you're lucky we found you and not the dogs." Miles of underground tunnels crisscrossed Washington, D.C., even plunging under the Potomac. It was a relic of Cold War paranoia when American planners feared the Soviets would find a way to hit Washington with a nuke without any prior warning. The irradiated landscape would make evacuation impossible, so it would be easier to simply move the government underground. Every major government building had an access point, with hidden exits concealed in surrounding office buildings, banks, hospitals, and even homes and apartments. There were a half-dozen major population shelters as well, each with living and working space for different government agencies and branches of government, or at least those that survived a nuclear blast and could get underground fast enough. It was the perfect home for a brewing resistance movement, and the elves struggled to locate the network. They successfully raided one shelter, but resistance forces flooded that section with water from the Potomac, drowning hundreds of elves and, unfortunately, any human survivors they had secured. I tried to keep track of the twists and turns but found it impossible. Without Sergeant Jackson's help, we'd never see the light of day again. Eventually, he dropped us off at a makeshift command bunker, complete with video feeds from cameras covertly placed around the city and hardwired into the city's